Well, good Monday morning. This is Senator Dick Black, retired senator, retired colonel, and welcome to Focus on the News. Glad to have you with us this Monday morning, September the 18th, 2023. And today we're going to talk about the sad legacy of critical race theory. If you'd like to share this with any of your friends, you can just have them contact us by going on Twitter, and the address is at SEN Richard Black, standing for at Senator Richard Black, SEN Richard Black. Okay, we want to talk today about critical race theory. Critical race theory is widely taught in public schools throughout the nation. It is in almost every university in some form or fashion. A lot of times they don't call it critical race theory because that term has become toxic, but it goes under headlines such as social justice, equity, and these other terms, which are part and parcel of the ideology of critical race theory. This has permeated corporate boardrooms, the military, it's all over the military, and government at every level. The foundation of critical race theory is a not so subtle racial hatred directed principally at working class European Americans, Caucasians, whites, and to a lesser extent towards Asians. Often we have seen the critical race theory sort of marching under the banner of Black Lives Matter and Antifa, the rainbow sodomy flag, and the Black Lives Matter, of course, combines. It's a movement that combines Black academics, politicians, many Black politicians, and a great number of violent street thugs. But the critical race theory, the Black Lives Matter business, it's not strictly a Black phenomenon. And I'm not talking about a few token whites who are a part of it. There are quite a large number of very wealthy white liberals, and they're entitled teenage children. Often they're college students. And together, those white liberals and their college children who like to get involved in the street movements, they accuse less affluent whites of subconscious racism. And although very, very few of these people really have friends at that social class, the kind of people who just do day-to-day work, people who are out on construction jobs and people who are working in different stores and so forth. The idea that these white mega millionaires in their gated communities know what goes on deep in the subconscious of these people. They don't know. All they've seen some stuff in the movies, and from that they draw their ideas. So we have, a lot of the homosexuals waving the rainbow flags at these race riots and so forth. They have a very deep disdain for white Christians and for heterosexual, normal family people. Now, the idea behind critical race theory is that you excuse every inner city problem as having some sort of roots in ancient slavery, which ended 6, 7 generations ago. Nobody alive has ever experienced slavery. Very few people alive now have experienced segregation. I mean, it's getting to be a very diminishing number of people. But instead of blaming all problems of minority races on some sort of systemic racism, don't you think that it might be better to for folks who are so concerned about these problems to take some degree of responsibility for the terribly high crime rates in their communities? How about the misbehavior in the inner city schools? Honestly, I don't know how a teacher can function in many of these schools. They're out of control. There's violence. There's attacks, physical attacks on the teachers, and so it might also be good if many of the members, particularly the Black community, would begin to hold accountable some of their elected officials. Why is it? I was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm familiar with Baltimore, and I would never go back. I would caution anybody never to go into the city of Baltimore if they value their lives. The population of Baltimore today. Now, Baltimore, you need to understand, when I was a boy, Baltimore was a thriving, exciting city. It was filled with industry, with jobs. It's where things were made in America, and I believe the Baldwin Locomotive Works may have been there where my father worked, and you had ship mills or you had shipyards. You just had all kinds of the steel mills, all kinds of things, and the population of Baltimore. Now, this is long before I was ever born. Back in 1920, the population today in Baltimore is lower than it was in 1920. So you have to ask you, why in this thriving, explosively energetic city of Baltimore, why would the population simply begin to evaporate? Well, it evaporated because of racial violence. You had the minorities in the city of Baltimore turn against their neighbors, their white neighbors, and they began to drive them out through physical violence. And so once you start this, you can have demonstrations, you can have things, but at a certain point, if the violence becomes so great, then you begin to have the street thugs put in power their own politicians, who then cater to the mobs, and as a consequence, the city of Baltimore it is truly a cesspool. It is filthy. It is covered with graffiti. Gunshots ring out. It's just a mess. So, instead of the critical race theory, I think it might be good just to have some very serious introspection about what exactly is wrong in our major cities. What's wrong with LA? What's wrong with Detroit? What's wrong with Chicago? What's wrong with Baltimore? It's violence. It's racial hatred. This isn't white people, expressing racial hatred. This is the people expressing racial hatred towards whites, against whites. this whole idea of the critical race theory, which has taken over, it's got this idea that somehow you can look at statistics. You can say, okay, look, a white neighborhood over here, it doesn't have crime. The houses are well kept. People are safe, and that somehow all of this was inherited by these people from generations, and it goes back 7 generations. Nothing goes back 7 generations, but to the purveyors of critical race theory, all the things that have benefited white residents of predominantly white neighborhoods, all of that comes as a result of slaves doing work back on plantations. I don't understand the logic of it, but that's the way that it is. And the level of hatred, I have to tell you, in all honesty, when I was a teenage boy, I used to take a very strong stand against segregation, because I've been around for a long time, and there was segregation back then, and I was opposed to it. But I wasn't opposed to it because I hated anybody. It was because I thought that segregation was demeaning. It was belittling to people who are human beings, just like me. You know, they may look different, they may have a different skin color, but they really were entitled to be treated equally under the law. I believe that, and I still believe it. And I took a stand at a time when doing that was considered heroic, although it didn't require a lot of heroism. It was a little tense, because I did it alone. I didn't do it with some big mob behind me. I just took a stand by myself, and so I believe today what I believed back then, which is that the law should treat people equally, and the law has no business demeaning or belittling anyone, whether they are black or whether they are white. Give you an example of just how poisonous this critical race theory has become, because you can see it's seeping into the major universities. Now, I saved this article. And these things are going on today. This just happens to be a couple years back. But this is January of 2021. There was a New York psychiatrist who gave a presentation at Yale University, and her topic was psychopathy of the white mind. So her basic premise was that white people are mentally sick in a psychopathic manner. Now, here's a comment from her presentation. This is a psychiatrist, Aruna Kilanani, and she was addressing an audience at the very prestigious Yale School of Medicine. So Yale Medical School had invited her to speak. And during this presentation that she made, she said, and I quote her, she said, she had fantasies of unloading a revolver into the head of any white person who got in her way, burying their body and wiping my bloody hands as I walked away, guiltless, with a bounce in my step. There was another New York psychiatrist who published a paper around the same time comparing white people to flesh-eating parasites for which there is no permanent cure. Now, naturally, it comes to your mind, of course, there's a permanent cure. If if people are nothing but flesh-eating parasites, isn't genocide the logical cure for something so terrible? But going back to Aruna Kilanani, okay, she had fantasies of unloading a revolver into the head of any white person. Okay, a man, a woman, a little boy, a little girl, an infant in a baby carriage, any white person who got in her way. Not anybody who was doing something to her, but basically anybody who crossed her path. She felt entitled, under critical race theory, I think, to just murder them on the spot. And then she would take great pleasure in wiping her bloody hands as she walked away, guiltless, and with a bounce in her step, with this sense of joy that she's killed people. Honestly, I don't recall the Nazis saying anything worse than that about anybody else. You know, if you talk about the joy of wiping someone's blood from your hands, and keep in mind who this is. This is a psychiatrist who is sufficiently prominent to be speaking at Yale University Medical School. Now, we know there are always sick and murderous people with twisted minds. The prisons are full of them. We have them. So you could say, well, this woman was just one of those very twisted people. But I think you have to think, what does this say about our society when a university like Yale Medical School can say, come on in here, this is great, you know, you're the kind of person that people need to hear from. This kind of language, this had to be the foundation for the vast slaughter of people in the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin, where people were just marched off and butchered by the millions, or under Adolf Hitler, where this kind of atmosphere towards other people took hold, and people felt empowered to express those views. I can't imagine any of the views by any of those mass murdering people were any more explicit than what you have here by this New York psychiatrist at Yale University. So this is a very real problem. I pulled up an article from abcnews.go. So it's ABC News, basically. And it's an article on systemic racism, microaggression, and white fragility story. And it's entitled, this goes back a couple of years. It says, what do terms like systemic racism, microaggression, and white fragility mean? Now, those are terms, this is part of this enormous array of made up, vaguely defined terms that fall under the rubric of critical race theory. So the article says, understanding these terms is important in efforts to tackle racism, experts say. Well, it may be helpful to understand what these terms mean to the extent that they have any fixed meaning at all. But to say that this is part of an effort to tackle racism, the racism, whatever racism exists out there, is 1,000 times worse among the practitioners of critical race theory. And but it is interesting. Let's see what they say. This is an article by Halima Abdullah, who is writing this article for abcnews.go. And so Hamila Abdullah talks to Andrea Gillespie, who is an associate professor of political science and the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory University. So we have another prominent university involved. And here's some examples of what is white privilege. Now, white privilege is one of these critical race theory ideas. And here's a quote from this professor. White privilege is not worrying what type of mask to wear because coronavirus doesn't impact your community as much. I maybe, I suppose a virus affects one group more than another. I'm not sure which one it affects more, but how are white people responsible for infections by the coronavirus in the Black community? It's just this idea that anytime there's something that goes wrong, if there's an earthquake, it has to do with some fundamental plot by white people. There's no limit to what it is. Coronavirus, the virus is traveling around based on white privilege. This is bizarre. Now, one of the fundamental ideas of critical race theory is that our entire legal system is structured around privilege for white people and oppression of Blacks. But I defy, to this day and always, I defy anyone to show me a single law, single statute, a single ordinance, a single regulation, a single rule, a single corporate policy that gives preference to white people over Black people. And I've gone out to these demonstrations where, particularly at the school board meetings, where you have this combination of all of these transgender homosexual activists, and you have the Antifa BLM people, and they'll be up there chanting, about systemic racism and all this, and I'm always kind about it. I'm never confrontational or never call names or try to humiliate anybody, but I go up and I say, can you give me not 1,000 examples? I don't want 1,000 examples. Can you pick out, just give me one single law, statute, regulation, corporate policy? It doesn't have to be here in Northern Virginia or DC or somewhere around here. Anywhere in the nation. Just find one remote little ordinance from a town of 500 people that gives preference to white people over Blacks. And of course, they never have an answer because there is none. There isn't. Nothing has been more powerfully pounded into the brains of American people than you cannot discriminate against people if they are Black, or other minorities. And the answer they come back with is, well, driving while Black, and more than one of them, driving while Black. And I said, well, that's a notion. That's not a law. That's not a regulation or anything. I said, what I'm looking for is a law, because you're saying the entire nation is structured on this web of all of these laws and regulations and things that give preference to whites over blacks. And I've tried to search out and to find an example somewhere. This doesn't really qualify, but it's the closest that I can find. This same individual, Andrea Gillespie from Emory University, said, now here's a problem, she says. Military rules that disallowed hairstyles such as locks, cornrows, and braids are also an example of institutionalized racism. And then in the article, in the ABC article, shows a photo of a black Marine sitting in a barber chair. He's got long hair. And the title of it is, "A Marine Corps recruit has his hair shorn during the early mornings hours of his training at Parris Island, South Carolina." Well, I can tell you, because I went through Parris Island, South Carolina, as a private, as a recruit, and you walked in a line. You were all dressed the same, identically, and you went in and you stood in line, and one by one you got in a barber chair. Now I had a beautiful head of hair back in those days. I had this almost black, really thick hair. It was sort of in an Elvis Presley hairstyle. Others would go in and they did the blonde hairdo. This is sort of before hairstyles got as long as they did. But there were black recruits, and they would have, a distinctive hairstyle. It didn't tend back at those days to be the afro with the huge hair style, but it tended to be a little bit long and so forth. And so all of us had hairstyles from our neighborhood. Well, you went in and they took an electric razor and they ran it. I think they used to start right down your forehead and go to the back, and then from there. And when you walked out, you were bald-headed. You didn't have hair. Didn't matter if you were black. Didn't matter if you were white. Didn't matter if you were Mexican American. You were bald. Now, what they were trying to do is they were trying to create a sense of identity and a sense of unity. For the same reason that we would go out and we'd do close order drill, which is marching, where the drill instructor would call the cadence and you're doing left face and right face and all of these movements. And they're training you to act together instantly on military orders, and to function as a disciplined group. Same thing with the hairstyle. They didn't want individualism in the military. They wanted unity. They wanted people as much as possible to act and feel and be like everyone else. And so it didn't matter what skin color you had. You're going to look you're going to look like a Marine. And it was a good policy. So the problem that I have with this thinking is that it begins with the presumption that somehow a black Marine has a right to political expression by the way that they groom themselves, but that nobody else has that right. The rest shave their hair off, but you're going to have special rules for particularly for the blacks, and And I think it's unfortunate. It's a sad thing because, you know, I remember back in the heyday, the early days before you had these violent civil rights riots and things, those of us who dreamed of racial equality, and I confess I was very much a part of it, the hope was that we would treat, you know, governments would treat people alike, and that you know, we hoped that there would be some mutual respect among people. Maybe we were naive. I grew up in Miami, Florida, so we had sort of a Southern idea of courtesy. Uh, even under segregation, people didn't just go around and say mean things to blacks who were under segregation. It's just segregation was the rule, and people abided by it. But unfortunately, when we overcame segregation, and when our black brothers were and sisters were allowed to come in on the same in the same way that we did and treated in that same method. Unfortunately, there were violent elements who took control of what then became civil rights movement, and it really turned into a very hate-filled movement, and it was sad. I've always regretted it. Now, the article, the ABC article, goes on and it talks about the legacy of redlining. And there's someone, Zinzi Bailey, a social epidemiologist at the University of Miami School of Medicine, and talked about this notion of redlining, which again, this is very much critical race theory. And the idea is that that insurance companies and mortgage companies in particular had certain areas of the city where either they wouldn't issue mortgages, or if they did, they expected a higher interest rate, higher return to pay for the higher risks. I'm not sure. I don't think it had the slightest thing to do with race. They didn't say, okay, let's see where all the black people is, and we're going to charge more there. No, what they did is they looked at things like the crime patterns, the scores on, you know, how likely were people to repay their debts, what were their credit scores, and based on that, it turned out there were areas that were much more high risk for the mortgage companies. And so most of them didn't just stop lending, but they did charge rates that would allow them to recover their investment. And now this Zinzi Bailey from University of Miami pointed out some of the things that people suffer in these inner city neighborhoods, and correctly, there are not as many grocery stores, as convenient and as nice in some of these neighborhoods. But you know, when I was young, I built subsidized housing in a place called Liberty City. That's a section in Miami, Florida. Very troubled, very honestly, very deadly area to be in. And I would go there during the daytime and put up houses. And but the reason that the federal government was building them there, and these were subsidized, so the reason was that the whole business area had been burned out. There'd been tremendous violence, and so I know very clearly why weren't there grocery stores in that neighborhood where I was building houses? You think it could be because grocery stores there are routinely raided by thieves? They're burned, they're looted. Could it be that it's that and not some sort of racism at work? I think you've got your answer right there. This person said, well, what about public transportation? Well, there is public transportation available in most all minority neighborhoods, but it's unsafe. Now, why is it unsafe? Is it because you have white people who say, okay, let's take this area of the city, let's make this unsafe? Or do you think it's more likely that the reason that it's unsafe is because the people in those neighborhoods, not all of them, they're always very fine people, and I met and worked with many of them when I was building houses, but do you think that the fact that a store owner building a store, stocking it, putting his life savings into creating this store, do you think he might be a little more reluctant to build in an area where he's going to stand maybe a 1 in 3 chance of being murdered during the time he runs the store? And maybe he'll stand a 75% chance that over the span of 10 years that his store will be burned down. Do you think he might take into account the fact that sometime within the next 3 to 5 years, a gang of thugs is likely to smash down the window and rush in and steal everything and just have people flood into the store and steal everything that's there? For some reason, the purveyors of critical race theory imagine away those things, and they say, no, it's you know, the owners of these stores, they can deal with that stuff. It's this subtle, unseen racism at work. No, it isn't. No, it's this obvious, very visible violence and thievery and looting and so forth. That's the source of the problem. Now, it is true that there is a handful of people in these neighborhoods, and maybe it's 5%. In Chicago, I think the police estimate it's about 7%. But these are people who they just live by crime. They're members of gangs, and they really don't care if they go to prison because all their friends are in prison. They get to visit with them. Now, how about the schools? You know, there's often criticism of schools. Critical race theory would say that minority students have problems because the invisible hand of white racism is at work. But who's setting the low standards in those schools? And do you think that perhaps misbehavior has some impact on the way that these things work out? In any event, you get the picture. The critical race theory, not only is it totally wrong and without any foundation whatsoever, but it's a very dangerous concept because it takes the problems within one community and simply refuses to acknowledge any responsibility whatsoever. And it casts the responsibility for those failings on people who don't have those failings in their communities. Very, very dangerous, very Marxist, very communist type of thinking. So in any event, we've got our problems. We are going to have to get control of it. The very first thing, you cannot achieve anything in the minority communities until you solve the problem of crime. And you're not going to solve the crime unless you crack down and you punish criminals. We've done away with stop and frisk, which was very effective. We've got to get back. We've got to say, you know what? You can talk about all this theory as long as you want, but until you take clear action and correct the problem, it will continue to exist. So, okay, that is all for today. I thank you for being with us, and we look forward to having you back with us in the near future, and we'll be back with you next Monday. Focus on the News. I'm Senator Dick Black. Thank you very much for joining us.